Okay. All right. So, welcome to Sunday School. It's the 16th of August, and today we're going to start a new quarterly. This one is Proverbs, or Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as I learned it, and as King James calls that book. So today we're going to first introduce the new book and just a little bit of background on Proverbs and Song of Songs. There are only, I think, only two lessons in this quarterly out of Song of Solomon. So there are 13 lessons, 13 sessions, and the first 11 are out of Proverbs, and then there are only two out of Song of Songs. So we'll talk a little bit of the introduction and then get into the first lesson for this week, which will come out of Proverbs chapter 1, and it's verses 7 through 19, which I'll have on the screen, and we'll also have in the study guide. So to start with, on page 8, if you want to look in the study guide, or I'll just talk about it, on page 8 is the introduction to this quarter, Proverbs and Song of Songs, and it says, the book of Proverbs provides us with wisdom that comes from God. And it's funny, as you get more familiar with the Bible, you'll hear, out in the world, you'll hear these little sayings of wisdom and things like that. And it wasn't for me until I really started kind of reading through the Bible that I realized that a lot of those wisdom sayings came from Proverbs. It's not something that some wise man thought of. I saw something someone said this week in the news or in a story that I read, or maybe it was something else. Anyway, someone referenced Abraham Lincoln as Abraham Lincoln wisely said, and they had this little quote that they attributed to Abraham Lincoln. And when I read it, I said, okay, Abraham Lincoln said that, but it came from the Bible. It came from Proverbs. So a lot of people don't realize that that's where a lot of these things come from. But anyway, so this quarter, at the introduction, it says, the book of Proverbs provides us with wisdom that comes from God. The book of Proverbs was written by primarily Solomon. Okay, Solomon, if you think back to the story of him, of course, Saul was the first king, didn't do so good. David replaced him, although David had his faults. David was a very good king. And then when it came time for David to die, God told him that his son Solomon would be the next king. And an interesting thing from that story was when Solomon was, I don't know if it was just before he became king or just after, I can't remember, but God came to Solomon and said, what would you ask of me? And Solomon said, Lord, what I want from you is wisdom, so that as a king I can do the right thing. And God told him, because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you wisdom. And because you didn't ask for fame or wealth or strength and power, I'm going to give you all those things too. So I guess that was probably the first wise thing that Solomon did. And Solomon was named in the Bible as the most wise king ever. So because he had the wisdom to ask for God's help, God's wisdom, God gave him that. And also because of his humility and wisdom, God gave him everything else. So there's a lesson right there. And so when you pray, the tendency for everyone, and I don't want to make this sound in a bad way, to pray a selfish prayer, because a lot of times if you have a need, that's what we ask God for. So it's selfish by the literal definition is what I'm trying to say there. But there are a lot of times, especially after, again, being more familiar with the Bible, I try sometimes to pray, Lord, especially if there's a situation, a family situation, a sickness or something like that, a decision that you have to make. Instead of saying, Lord, I need for you to help me get this job. I need for you to help me make this money. I need for you to help me, whatever the specific thing is. It's okay for us to ask that. But also, I try to ask for God's wisdom as I'm making a decision. Help me to discern the right way to do this. And God is faithful, and He will help you to do that. And we'll see in here in the lesson. Human nature is not to do that. It's to try to do things on our own, in our own wisdom and our own strength, or our own knowledge. Okay. So this book of Proverbs, primarily written by Solomon, it says there are a couple of references that say the last two chapters, and it's named in those chapters. Let me just think ahead here in my Bible real quick. Chapter, I think it's 30 and 31. Yeah, in chapter 30, it starts with the words of Agur, the son of Jacob. So Agur, it's attributed to him as writing the 30th chapter. And then in chapter 31, it says the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. So 30 and 31, the last two chapters, have someone's name other than Solomon on them. Now, in my Bible, under the note under chapter 31, it says King Lemuel means devoted to God, an unknown king credited with writing Proverbs 31, possibly King Solomon or Hezekiah. So even in here, I don't know. There are two names on those last two chapters, but for the most part, Solomon is attributed with writing this. Now, back to the study guide, it says seeking God's wisdom. So first of all, again, the book of Proverbs provides us with wisdom that comes from God. And the next thing I want to note is the word wisdom is all throughout Proverbs. These sayings that Solomon wrote down, they're primarily about getting that wisdom of God, and you'll see it over and over and over again. Everything tends to point back to that wisdom. So it says in the study guide, seeking God's wisdom means nurturing a close relationship with Him. That's starting, and that in verse 7, where we'll start the lesson today, you'll see that. So that the first 6 verses is kind of an introduction, and starting in verse 7, that's a very powerful verse that pretty much summarizes all of Proverbs. From there, it says Solomon provides us with an exhaustive assortment of Proverbs to address almost every facet of our everyday lives. There's something that relates to everything. And the next reference I'm going to show you real quick is, let me see if I can make it come up in here. 1 Kings 4:32. Just to take us back to when Solomon became king, you can see in verse 32, and this is talking about Solomon, and he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. So David was at war all of his reign as king. He was fighting the whole time. Solomon, because of what David had done, Solomon had a pretty much a peaceful reign, so he could focus on trying to ask God's wisdom out, and he did. There aren't 3,000 written in the book of Proverbs, but he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He was a very prolific Proverbs writer. All right, so back to verse 7 of Proverbs. All right, now, then it goes on to say here very quickly about Song of Songs, which is the second book that we'll cover at the end of this quarter. It says, Song of Songs is an extended poem that affirms the value of choosing to live according to God's wisdom when it comes to nurturing the love between a man and a woman. Solomon also wrote Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as it's called in the King James, and it's sort of a romantic story about Solomon and one of his wives. She was a Shulamite. That was her heritage. And it kind of talks a little bit about sort of their dating and their marriage and how important that is. God's vision of the relationship between a man and a woman. So there are a couple of lessons that we'll go to out of that. But again, the primary focus is Proverbs. And before we get out of the introduction on page 8, there's a section in the center of the page that says Themes in Proverbs. I'm going to read these. And I want you to notice again that word wisdom. It's in every statement. So here we'll start with the first one. It says these are themes in Proverbs. God's wisdom comes only through a personal relationship with Him. The next one, the temptation to give in to foolishness and the need to choose wisdom serves as an ongoing concern for God's people as we live for Him every day. Keep in mind that temptation to give in to foolishness. That's part of today's lesson. Being wise, the next one, being wise and overcoming menacing temptations means that we seek the Lord's wisdom and put it to work. Again, part of today's lesson. Being wise and overcoming temptations requires seeking the Lord's wisdom. Next, seeking God's wisdom and applying it in our lives allows us to learn how He wants us to handle the issues that confront us in work, play, money, and relationships. So think about our prayer request this morning with relationship to school, relationships, family, whatever it is. Seeking God's wisdom and applying it to our lives allows us to learn how God, wants us to handle the issues that confront us in work, play, money, and relationships. Then finally, it says God wants us to enjoy the fulfillment that comes from being wise in Him. So again, wisdom is throughout this. That's the purpose of these Proverbs, is to impart or to give that wisdom out to God's people. And whether they realize it or not, again, a lot of people have these sayings that they've heard or from wherever, or maybe they read somewhere. They may or may not realize that a lot of them came from the Bible, from Proverbs. All right, the title of today's lesson, this is from page 10. The title of the lesson is called Charted Waters. Now, have you all ever heard of the term uncharted waters? Have you heard that expression, uncharted waters? Okay, if you think about it, and if you look at the picture on page 10, if you've got your book open, the picture at the top of the page is of a ship laying on its side in the surf. Okay, so let's relate that to the charted waters thing. If you think about back in the days before, when people first started exploring, and they take a ship and they're on the edge of some water, whether it be a lake or the ocean or whatever it is, and they say, we're going to go explore and see what's out there. Well, the first ones that went out had no idea what to expect, right? And so there were probably a lot of ships that ended up like this one because they did not know what they're literally going to run into. As people became familiar with it, they started making charts or maps that showed where these hazards were, okay? So that's what allows the follow-on generations of sailors, in this case, to navigate without putting themselves in danger. So uncharted waters is a bad thing, and that's where we start, is we don't know what to expect. Charted waters means that someone has gone before us and laid down something, some kind of guidance in the form of a map or a chart in this case, over water that helps. So that's what Proverbs in the Bible really is to chart those waters to help us. If we lean and turn to the Bible, God's Word, and then the teachings through Sunday school, the pastor, Holy Spirit, parents, wise friends, if you will, it will help us avoid these hazards. All right. On page 10, in the introduction of today's lesson, it says, the knowledge of God and the knowledge to live wisely are interrelated. Next to the knowledge of God and salvation, the knowledge to live wisely is the most important kind of knowledge. Godly knowledge is more than information. It's about transformation. You can be factually right, but spiritually wrong. And there's a question at the bottom of page 10 that says, how would you describe the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And here's how I would look at that. Knowledge, like when you go to school, you're going to be taught subjects. You're going to be taught about science, about history, about math. And hopefully your teachers are well versed enough in it to put it in a way that you understand it. I'm a big fan of math, and as I've told our girls and Emory, you will use math all your life. It's very important, even though a lot of the subjects can be painful and some of it gets complicated, especially when you get into advanced math and things like that. Depending on your profession, you may or may not use those advanced math concepts. I'll just tell you that. But basic math is very important. I mean, when you think about making change or just things like that. So to go back to knowledge versus wisdom, knowledge is that information that someone's providing to you that goes into your brain of how things are done. How does math work? The history of things. Science, what does it mean? Now, when you think about wisdom, to me, wisdom means how you take that knowledge that you have and how you apply it to do good things, smart things, to solve tasks, to help yourself in your life. So that to me is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is the information. Wisdom is how to use it. And in the context of Proverbs in the Bible, relying on God to help you apply that knowledge in a wise way, that's what this whole quarter is going to be about. Okay, page 11 in the study guide, again, context for today's lesson. It says the book of Proverbs begin with an invitation and a warning. The invitation comes in the form of a call to be wise, and we'll see that here in just a moment. Solomon urged anyone who would listen to hear and obey the call to walk in the path of God's wisdom. That's the invitation. Anybody who reads this, here's my Proverbs, you need to want to walk in the path of God's wisdom. The second part, the warning, it says there's a warning here as well. Solomon warned of the trouble that awaits any who will not heed the call to live wisely. And I'll tell you, in my life, in my family, with my friends, with myself, there have been times in my life that, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I did not make wise choices. And I know people, and I'm related to people who have not made wise choices. And I know all of us are too. There's somebody in our families that has not made wise choices. And at the time, You don't necessarily think ahead to the consequences of those choices that you make. Looking back or looking from the outside at choices that someone else has made, it becomes very easy to see the consequences of bad choices. Right? And so that's the warning from Solomon here is there's trouble awaiting anyone who does not heed the call to live wisely. And again, that's turning to God. Importantly here, and we'll see it, you can see in verse 8 right there, who he's speaking to. My son. So he is speaking to his son, but it's lessons from God to the world. So Solomon turned his attention to his son. His son would need to make up his mind to walk in God's wisdom. I don't know how old his son was here, but you'll see he was being tempted with gang type of stuff is a way to relate it. Making the decision to follow God's wisdom would not be easy for Solomon's son, since he would encounter, and relate this to yourself. Think about this. Making that decision to walk in God's wisdom would not be easy, since Solomon's son, me, you, particularly as young people who don't have the experiences in life yet, that decision won't be easy because you will encounter evil people who would try to entice you to join them. And I'm not saying that the kids you're going to school with are evil people per se, but if they're not a Christian, Satan is going to be working in them. Satan's going to be working against you as a Christian to tempt you. But in Solomon's time, and he was probably a little older than you, the son, you will encounter evil people who would try to entice him to join them. They would try to persuade him that the road they took would be fun. It would involve violence, murder, and theft. That don't sound like a lot of fun to me, but if you're a gang type person, or if you're a person that doesn't have any kind of morals or conscience, doesn't have any guidance, any guideposts in your life, if it feels good, do it. I'm the strongest. I'm going to do what I want, regardless of how it hurts or takes something away from somebody else. Imagine a world like that, and it's existing right now today. There are people out there in our country and all over the world that don't have any kind of a tether, a moral grounding to help them understand that the things they're doing are just absolutely not right. They're out there burning things down. They're looting, stealing. They're hurting people. I've seen a video of a man walking down the street. I think it was New York. And there's an older lady coming the other way, and he just reaches as he passes her and pushes her over. She's on a walker. And he just pushes her over, and she falls and hits her head against a fire hydrant. I mean, they took her to the hospital. But there are people that just do, you just wonder, why in the world would somebody do something like that? Well, that is an act of just evil without any conscience or care for other people, right? And that's kind of an extreme example. There's a story in the news right now about a young boy, 5 years old, in North Carolina, who was out on Sunday afternoon after going to Sunday to church with his family. He was out riding his bicycle with his two older sisters. And apparently he rode into the neighbor's yard with his bicycle, and his neighbor's son, who was 25 years old, walked out with a pistol and put it to his head and shot him. A 5-year-old boy. How in the world? Why would somebody think that that's okay to do? That's just evil. I don't know if this young man had a mental problem. I don't know the circumstances yet. He's in jail. He's going to go to trial. So, the system will hopefully take care of that appropriately. And I also hope for that young man that did the murderous act that somehow he's exposed to the plan of salvation, that God will work in his life. He can repent from that. He can still be saved, right? But why did he do it? I don't know. So there's a lot of bad out there. Okay. So anyway, this is Solomon again talking to his son. They would his friends or the people he were with might try to persuade him that the road they took would be fun. It would involve violence, murder, and theft. Solomon warned that these gang members themselves would eventually have their lives stolen from them. Even if you get away with it your whole life, whatever it is you're getting away with, there will come a time when you'll be judged, whether it be on this earth or in the next life. Okay, the consequences of rejecting godly truth and wisdom are devastating, and that's the lesson Solomon's trying to impart. Both of these great admonitions, the invitation to hear and obey, and the warning that your unwise actions will have consequences, both of these admonitions are summed up in one of Solomon's most famous sayings, and that's verse 7. We'll look at it right here, and then we'll read the next ones in a few minutes. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." So we'll take that apart in just a minute. The last part of the understand the context, it says, it is within this context of this verse 7, that Solomon methodically and urgently began his book. Solomon's call, which is God's call through Solomon, for the people of God to live within the safe boundaries of God's wise counsel is needed now just as it was needed then. And I told you a couple of stories that are just horrific. I mean, these are just in the one was last week, and one was in the last couple of months. It's just as important now as it was then. It is the wise person who hears and obeys the call of God. It is the wise person who considers Solomon's warnings. It is the fool who rejects both. All right, that could be the lesson right there. But I'm going to press forward and just we're going to really kind of more focus on just this verse 7, and then I'll kind of go through the last part relatively quickly about his son's friends and the gang and all that kind of what awaits them. But on the study guide on page 12. So let's look at. I'm going to read just verses 7 through, I think the lesson is 7 through 19. I'm going to read them just so you can get the whole context of the lesson. And then we'll come back and talk more about 7 and then a little bit about the rest. So Proverbs 1, verse 7. Here we go. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother." So pay attention to both parents, not just one. Verse 9, "For they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck." And that's the instructions he's talking about. "For these instructions will be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck," as in a decoration, not chains of slavery. Verse 10, "My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If they say, Come with us, let us lay wait for blood. Let us lurk privily or privately for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in thy lot among us. Let us all have one purse. My son, walk not thou in the way with them. Refrain thy foot from their path, for their feet run to evil and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, and they lay wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives. So are the ways of every one that is greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof. All right, so there's the King James. I'll put it in CSB so you can see that. It's might be a little bit more understandable for you. And we'll go back down to verse 7. All right. Okay, so again, it separates verse 7 from the rest of this. You can see that avoid the path of the violent. There will be his advice. But let's kind of take apart verse 7 here. I'm on page 12 of the study guide, and there's a pretty long discussion about this. It starts with the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So when you think of fear, what normally, and I think of fear of being afraid, being to the point of just being really scared of something, whether it be you're afraid of thunder, lightning, spiders, snakes, jumping off the high dive, driving a car for the first time. There are lots of things that make us fearful or afraid, right? First day of school, going to the middle school or what used to be called junior high school for the first time, instead of assuming you get to go back, instead of sitting in one classroom all day with all of your friends and being taught subjects, the thought of that was the scariest thing to me when I went to rugby. In seventh grade back then was, am I going to be able to change classes in time? On the third day, am I going to remember where my classrooms are? I mean, it's, every single, I think, child goes through that as you go through those schools, right? And you learn, okay, it's not that hard because you have the same class with 2 or 3 other people, your friends. And if nothing else, you kind of go with the crowd and follow along, right? So that's how I think of fear. But in this context, and I'm going to look back at the beginning of the book, there's a couple of definitions, and I'm going to read the one for fear. And it says, the fear of the Lord, that's how we'll put it in context. The fear of the Lord includes awe, reverence, trust, submission, and obedience. So when you think about the fear of the Lord, it doesn't mean be afraid of God. Now, there is a point. I mean, if you're continuously doing wrong, you need to be afraid that there will be consequences for it. But the fear of the Lord to me means also a reverence, and I'm in awe of God's power, of His goodness, of how stern He can be when required. Almost like you can relate it to the fear of a parent that hopefully you look to them for, you trust them, you look to them for wisdom. You know that there will be consequences if you do wrong. That's God on a infinite scale. But to complete the definition, fear of the Lord includes awe, reverence, trust, submission, and obedience. For enemies of God, rather than followers of God, the fear of God involves terror. So if you're not one of God's, that fear will involve terror because God will judge. And at the end of that, the wages of sin is death or hell. So if you're not right. So there's the fear of the Lord as the beginning of knowledge. In this one statement, it says on page 12, we find a summary of the whole book of Proverbs. To fear the Lord involves reverencing, respecting, and trusting Him. And at the bottom of that paragraph, it references Job, and it says Job 28:28 states, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. So there's that fear of the Lord. That's smart. That is wisdom. Taking the knowledge you have and applying it correctly. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn from evil is understanding. And it says, wisdom, therefore, has a starting point. In order to be wise, to take that knowledge and apply it, you have to have some basis for how you apply that knowledge. Wisdom, therefore, has a starting point. It begins with a sincere relationship with the Lord. Coming to a saving knowledge of God through the person of Jesus Christ, who is our wisdom, is the beginning of a life well lived. So that's what it comes down to. You can be the smartest man on the planet or smartest woman on the planet. If you don't apply your smarts correctly or wisely, then you're a fool. And that's what this is saying. No matter how smart someone is, if they think about it, there are some really smart criminals. So they're not using their knowledge for good, and there will be a consequence. All right, so the starting point of wisdom is that sincere relationship with the Lord. Now it says, sadly, at the bottom of that paragraph, the second paragraph on page 12, sadly, and I mentioned this earlier, many Christians look everywhere except to God's word for guidance in making wise choices. You can, well, I'm saved, and you kind of forget that there's more to it. It's not I'm saved and that's the end. Now I can just go back to my life or not worry about God or just trust that God's going to always help me make good decisions and all that. Sadly, many Christians look everywhere except to God's word for guidance in making wise choices. The way to wisdom and understanding begins with seeking God. I'm guilty of that too. If I need to do something, a lot of times I think, okay, the smartest choice to me seems to be do this. Sometimes I'll seek Cheryl's opinion. Okay, what do you think about this? How are we going to solve this problem? Or what are we going to do with this money? Or how are we going to do this thing? But even between the two of us, that still isn't the best way to go about making decisions. Ultimately, we will make the decision, but we should first seek God's wisdom. Now, at the bottom of page 12, not everyone responds positively to God's invitation. That's to walk in His way. Fools despise wisdom, it says, and there's a definition for those two words. The definition of a fool, biblically, and in our study guide it tells you, a fool is the antithesis or the opposite of a wise person. The Hebrew word suggests stubbornness. I've got some stubborn in me. I think everybody does, some more than others, like, me and my sweet bride, we both got our stubborn streaks. But anyway, so the fool is the opposite of a wise person. It says the Hebrew word suggests stubbornness. The term denotes moral perversion. Doesn't mean you're a pervert per se. It just means that you don't have that true moral logic and rationale for how you make your decisions. The fool thinks of himself as without error. He rejects godly wisdom because it contradicts his own view of knowledge. And there are lots of people that are very super smart. A lot of atheists that are just geniuses that will tell you there is no God. And I'm smart enough, I can tell you scientifically why there's no God. Well, so that's an arrogance right there, and that's what this is talking about. A fool thinks of himself without error. He rejects godly wisdom because it contradicts his own view of knowledge. He detests discipline because discipline involves correction, and correction implies he made an error. So again, it says the fools despise wisdom. The definition of wisdom here, it says biblical wisdom is a gift from God. It includes the knowledge of God, discipline, morality, and the ability to apply knowledge to overcome the problems of life. So again, this all goes back to wisdom and what it means. These fools on the bottom of page 12, it says they reject God's wisdom. The fool is the one who is morally and spiritually deficient. Rather than beginning a lifelong journey of knowing and loving God, The fool says in his heart that there is no God. See, Psalm 14:1. And I'll stick that in there just so you can see that. Have you all ever heard that? Psalm 14:1. 14:1. Here's how Psalm 14:1 starts. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And there are a lot of people. Every time I read this, I think of people that either whether they verbally say it, and there are a lot of people who will, or people who, by their actions, by their way of life, by the decisions they make, they're saying one way or the other, there is no God. There's no accounting. I'm not accountable to this mythical God that you fanatical Christian people or whatever profess or bow to. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And now you can relate that back to wine. That fool doesn't have that wisdom, has no desire to accept God's wisdom. At the top of page 13, it goes on to say, the fool may be intelligent by worldly standards, but cares little for the wisdom of God and refuses to accept God's loving discipline and wise instruction. So here's the last word we'll define, and that's discipline. To you all, when you think of discipline, what does it mean to be disciplined? Back when we were in school, to be disciplined, you could be called down by a teacher, but the ultimate form of discipline was to get the paddle. That doesn't happen anymore. And I think for the most part, it was fairly rare for the young ladies to get paddled. For some of the boys, I got one lick with a paddle in my whole school career, and it was very embarrassing because it was in the hallway, cutting up whatever, and one of the teachers came by, and he carried his with him, and he, whap right on the rear end, and that more than hurt, because I had been, we called it getting a whipping, but getting spanked when I was a kid. I had that happen to me. And my dad was much more disciplinarian than these teachers could be or would be. I mean, it wasn't about hurting people. It was about, anyway, for me, it embarrassed me so much because this was between classes when people were out in the hall at rugby. And I mean, it just made me feel this big. And it taught me a lesson of I don't ever want that to happen to me again. And that's kind of the point of discipline, is not to embarrass you or humiliate you, but to let you realize there are consequences. And I don't want that to happen. Okay. So now let's look at discipline again in the context of the Bible. Discipline says moral training and instruction that warns of the consequences of sinful actions or corrects those who have sinned. So there's what that discipline means in this context. It's not God literally spanking you, giving you a paddling, but there can be physical consequences as part of discipline. But this is, again, as it relates to Proverbs, moral training and instruction that warns of the consequences of sinful actions or corrects those who have sinned. So these wise fools, they refuse to accept God's loving discipline and wise instruction. Verse 7 reminds us that the dividing line between the wise and foolish person is not intellect, but a relationship with God. So back to verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. That is a lesson. That's the lesson for today. You carry that hopefully for the rest of your life. Here's where it is, Proverbs 1:7. If you ever need to reference it back. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through the rest of these verses here, just so you can see again what Solomon is to us by telling his son this. He's telling the world about why this is important. So he's telling his son, listen to your father's instruction. Don't reject your mother's teaching. This kind of goes back to God's plan for how, man and a woman are married. That's the family unit, father, mother, children, right, for generations. And when you start to see that family unit break up, which is very prevalent today, there are lots of problems come along with that. In a nuclear family, the father, mother, and children, that doesn't mean it's perfect. It's not Pollyanna. But that's God's model for how it should be. So Solomon says, listen to your father's instruction. Don't reject your mother's teaching. They're both very important because they both have different things to offer. Because what they're teaching you will be a garland of favor on your head and pendants around your neck. Or change as it said in King James. Again, it's a decoration. It's a good thing. Now, oh, here's the lesson. My son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. If they say, come with us, let us set an ambush and kill someone, let's attack some innocent person just for fun. And that happens today. To the extreme, gang members do that. Now, again, I know someone who in his youth, uh, high school, would drink. And, I drank in high school, my senior year. Got in trouble for it. I don't drink anymore, but that's just a choice that I made, a few years ago. Because here's how I look at it. Sit down one day and think about what good comes from it. It's expensive to buy the alcohol, and if you can come up with a list of good things that justify it, and I'm not saying you can't have a sip of wine as you get older and all that kind of thing. Moderation is very important, but just be careful. I know someone who got in trouble tearing things up with his friends, had too much to drink, tore some things up. The police came. He was too young to get arrested, but his dad found out about it, and he got in a lot of trouble. Okay. Later in life, he drank and got, you all know what a DUI is? Driving under the influence, a ticket. There are lots of people, if you see a lot of people riding around Hendersonville on scooters that are older, a lot of them, the reason they're on a scooter is because they cannot have a driver's license anymore because of some problem, drinking or drugs or whatever it was. Not all, I don't want to say it that way, but you don't have to have a license to drive a scooter on the roads. Okay, and it's a way to get back and forth. So there are long-lasting consequences. This person I'm talking about got a DUI. Luckily, he recovered from that. It didn't affect him as far as losing his license forever or anything like that. But later in life, he wanted to get into the Air Force. And they looked at his record, and on his record, they saw DUI. And so if I've got two people to choose from, and one, I look at them and they've lived a great life, they made good grades in school, they have no tickets, they have no crimes, no convictions, no anything like that. And I look at the other one, and they lived a good life. They've got great grades in school. They seem like to be a good person, just like this one. But I look and it says driving under the influence. And especially if there are two of that or that and something else, it makes it easier for me to choose, right? Which one? I mean, you, the person who had that offense, may have reformed yourself. You may be the best person on the planet, but I've got, a very short period of time to choose between you and you. You had a DUI. You had got into trouble as a kid. You've lived a pretty good life. Just based on this, I'm going to choose you and hope that I'm making the right decision. Okay, right, wrong, indifferent. Well, so again, here's what I'm saying is there are consequences that can follow you through your whole life. And again, that's not a sermon on drinking, although be careful. It's about the temptations, the decisions that you make. So back to this, Solomon's friends. If they say, come with us, let's set an ambush and kill someone. Let's attack some innocent person just for fun. Let's swallow them alive like Sheol, which is, like Hades, like those who go down to the pit, the grave, or Sheol was the grave, an open grave, like those who go down to the pit. We'll find all kinds of valuable property. So not only are we going to hurt them, but we're going to take the spoils, their property. We'll find all kinds of valuable property and fill our houses with plunder. Now that's stealing. Coveting what they have, right? These are all written down in 10 commandments somewhere that you shouldn't do. Okay, my son, don't travel down that road with them or set foot on their path. Don't even start down that path. If you start down that path, you can always recover. There is nothing at any time you can stop. Turn. That's that repent thing, right? Turn away from that old life. You can always do it. It gets harder sometimes, especially if you are addicted to something, whatever it is. A substance, a rush from, stealing or seeing how close you can get to getting in trouble and not, or whatever. And it doesn't have to go to crime. There are all sorts of things that they can tempt you. Okay. Verse 15, don't travel that road with them or set foot on their path because their feet run toward evil and they hurry to shed blood. Now, this verse 17, when it talks about a net and a bird, I didn't really understand that until I read here. It says it is useless to spread a net where any bird can see it. What that's saying is, if I'm a bird and I've got eyes and someone puts a net out to catch me and I can see it, am I going to blunder into that net and get caught? No, right? If I can see it, I'm going to turn and go around it. Okay. What he's saying here is when you get in with these friends, this is Solomon to his son, you're going to get caught up with them and you're not going to see this net that's right in front of you. this thing that's going to get you in trouble. You're not going to see it. And so what they're doing in verse 18, they set an ambush to kill themselves. They think they're going to be hurting others or gaining from the thing that they're doing, but ultimately what they're doing is hurting themselves. And this kind of goes to the people I was telling you about that just didn't think. A lot of times you just don't think farther than about this far in front of yourself. Whereas if you'd open your eyes and look just a little bit farther, you'd go, wow, this could really affect me. They're setting an ambush to kill themselves. They attack their own lives. That sort of goes to, before you make the decision or commit to doing something, think it through first. And in some cases, maybe a lot of cases, you'll decide against going down that path or continuing down that path or taking that action. Verse 19, it says, such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. It takes the lives of those who receive it. We've talked about this before, but the last thing I'm going to reference is 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12 through 13. And you'll hopefully remember this from just in the last, I think maybe in Romans it was referenced as well. I'll put it in King James first. So 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. And that's just saying be careful. You might think that you're upright, you can handle anything. Be careful, because you might take a fall. And here's some encouragement in verse 13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. There's no new things under the sun. I think that's in Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun, right? There is no temptation that you'll face, but that is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. All right? So let's put that back in CSB, a little bit more plain English. No temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation he will also provide a way out, so that you may be able to bear it. You think that you might be the first kid in the history of the planet whose friends say, hey, let's go out and drink this weekend. First one that says, let's go steal this thing, or let's go, and I'm not saying kids are all about drinking and stealing. Okay, those are sort of extreme, even though there's far more extremes than that. It's just, again, the temptations are out there. Please be careful. All right, beat that one up. I'm going to finish on the last page with just the bullets that summarize the lesson. First, and this is on page 18, it says, true wisdom starts with the right relationship with God. That's what it goes back to. Remember that verse 7? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. Proverbs 1:7. It's a very important verse. Next, obedience to godly counsel leads to favor in life. Paying attention to God's how He's trying to lead you and counsel you. Next, wise believers resist the pressure to engage in wicked activity. There will be temptation. Be wise. Do your best to resist it. If you don't, hopefully you don't get caught and get in bad trouble. Turn away. And finally, ignoring godly wisdom leads to self-destruction. And again, I've seen it. Okay, questions, comments? All right. Yeah. So see, that was to me that was a barn burner of the first lesson in Proverbs. So I'm very happy about that. And look forward to the next one. All right, I'm going to stop this here.